So we can see that population as it exists today is unevenly distributed throughout the globe, and at the same time increases in population will also potentially be disproportionately felt across the globe. Overall, from United Nations estimates, we see the slowing rate of population growth overall. That has taken 12 years to add 1 billion people, from not only 5 to 6 billion, but also 6 to 7 billion. According to UN estimates, there are now 7.2 billion people living on the planet. In 2025, there will be 8.1. In 2050, there will be 9.6. And by 2100, according to the United Nations, there will be 10.9 billion. I should point out that these studies are also based upon the idea that you have population that occurs, that the increased rate in population may be anywhere between 6.7 and up to 16.6 billion, depending on the projection overall. So how do individual states deal with population issues? And probably one of the most notable examples of this is China's one-child policy, and potentially selected for male children and female infanticide if one were to determine the sex of the child prior to birth. And with reproductive technologies and biomedicine, this is certainly possible today. And so China's one-child policy deals primarily in urban areas, and there are some exceptions for women and for families that would have essentially a girl first. So there are some exceptions to the national policy or the one-child policy overall. There's a lot to say about the one-child policy, and much of it, of course, has been written in accounts of this have been written in the United States media and reports along the lines of human rights issues overall, and concern about how China is carrying out these policies. However, for our focus here, I'd like to focus on Mexico. And this is specifically from the Braff article, Somos Muchos, We Are So Many, Population Politics and Reproductive Othering in Mexican Fertility Clinics. And Braff, in her 2013 piece in Medical Anthropology Quarterly, gives a overview of the history of reproductive policies and the state of Mexico's stance on reproduction overall. And we can see that in these pictures here, you can see of Mexico City to the right, clearly large segments of the population, 1/5 of the population of Mexico lives in Mexico City. And if you've ever been to Mexico City, places like the Zocalo during political rallies and speeches can be incredibly stifling in terms of the number of people, so much so that it's not even possible to move in any sort of direction at all. Of course, there's concern in urban areas with air pollution as well. The interesting thing about this article is that the problem of overpopulation in Mexico is not necessarily in urban areas, but it's something that's geographically dispersed throughout Mexico as a whole, and particularly the rural areas and indigenous populations. And this is the argument that Braff develops throughout her article. She talks about Mexico's changing stance in reproductive policy. In 1821, Mexico gains independence from Spain, and they have a very pronatal policy, that is to encourage families with many children. In 1910, with the onset of the Mexican Revolution and then the subsequent 10 years, leaders after the Mexican Revolution sought to fortify the nation with natural growth. So again, very much a pronatal policy and mindset in Mexico at the state level at this time. Between 1940 and 1970, however, there's a 157% increase in population. And this coincides with the population boom, as well as population becoming a concern in the so-called developing world. And Mexico, the state of Mexico, takes this so-called threat very seriously. And then in the 1970s, they moved towards what is referred to as responsible parenthood, which essentially is a massive family planning programs that were facilitated in part by the United States. Overall, the movement towards responsible parenthood has been very successful with a decrease in fertility rate. And so Mexico in 1960, you had 7.3 children per woman, compared to rates in 2010 of 2.2 children per woman. Now, I think it's important to point out here, this is very close to the fertility rate in the United States, which is an average of 2.06 children per woman in 2010. Yet, many in Mexico still perceive of an overpopulation problem and an issue of fertility overall. In Mexico, Branf continues, and she talks about the spiritual and moral valence that reproduction has in Mexico, and that many Mexicans view childhood as, or procreation and reproduction as divine. The idea that God sends one a child. Embodied within reproduction are familial ideas as well as gendered virtues. And the idea here that women get to truly become women as they are mothers. So motherhood becomes a valued part and indeed a centralized part of womanhood as a whole. It becomes part of defining the essence of what a woman is. Mexicans as a whole are very family and child-centric, that Branf points out. And she also draws parallels with the Virgin de Guadalupe, where you see maternity as centralized to the idealized notion of womanhood. At the same time, Article 4 of the Mexican Constitution provides the right of all Mexican citizens to reproduce. But the state encourages this unevenly along overlapping lines of race, class, and region. And particularly in a geographic context, we can see this develop in Branf's article, that family planning occurs in rural areas where you see the idea of fertility clinics, primarily in urban areas. So there's a geographic differentiation here between urban and rural areas in terms of where population should be expanded and where population should be contracted. And this goes to a larger discussion in anthropology and the social sciences about the notion of stratified reproduction and reproductive othering. And stratified reproduction is an idea that comes from Ginsberg and Rapp's work amongst African Americans in the United States, where African American women are seen as undisciplined breeders, but are seen as good child care providers for white women, white families as a whole. The notion of stratified reproduction is the procreation on families of elite are privileged over and even facilitated by non-elites. And so non-elites act as surrogates or nannies for elites in order to further their reproductive goals. This is related to stratified reproduction are discourses of reproductive othering. And this mirrors typical binaries of the West versus the East, modern versus backward, and superior versus inferior, and typecasting individuals along these very sharp dichotomies, these very sharp binaries. They either are in the superior category or the inferior category. They're either modern or they're backward. They're either Western Occidental or indigenous others, perhaps. So Branf talks about assisted reproduction technologies or arts, which are available in clinics and urban centers for the most part. And again, this reinforces the dichotomy, the spatial geographic dichotomy, where the focus is on providing to elites due to the high cost of both in vitro fertilization and artificial insemination. In Mexico, women utilizing arts juxtapose themselves to rural, indigenous, and urban poor who have long been construed as over-reproducers. And so the problem of overpopulation becomes a problem that is in and amongst the poor and the indigenous, the rural indigenous, not those that are modern, that are in urban centers, and that are relatively affluent. Women, in fact, deem themselves to be worthy of art, the assisted reproduction technologies, and even deserving of children by claiming to be whiter and worthier persons, parents, and citizens than others on the basis of their fertility practices. There are a number of accessibility criteria in order to be eligible for infertility care in Mexico, including Mexican citizenship, having to be under 36 for women or under 56 for men, being married or in a stable heterosexual union, having one or no children, having no other health insurance, and having proof of prior infertility exams. And all this, Braff argues, goes to this fundamental notion of how the state supports certain people in having children, but not others. And Braff goes on to discuss the notion of infertility as a typically urban problem. And she's interviewing one individual who says that she has a niece in Oaxaca, and she has her first baby at 15, right after she has her first period, and essentially those girls in the town, according to this woman, they don't have any place to go or aspirations, so they grab their first boyfriend and right away get pregnant. And so we can see in this discourse here that reproduction gets seen as this natural process for the rural poor girls in towns, and that women's lack of extra domestic goals and sexual self-control again get put on people from this part from Mexico, in this case Oaxaca. There's also discourses about urban poor women as being unfit mothers, and you can see this quote here from Dolores, who considers herself middle class, who quit her job to alleviate stress that she believed was keeping her from conceiving. And so she talks about the idea of urban women who do not properly take care of children, and hence they are not proper mothers as a whole. So this raises interesting questions about motherhood, about the idea of nationality, identity, and the notion of race in terms of who can be an appropriate mother, and where and how the state will back motherhood for some populations, but not for all, within the state boundaries as a whole. Manners, in his piece from 1981, Carrying Capacity, the Politics of Overpopulation, Cultural Ecology Revisited, he's a student of Julian Stewart's, and he looks at the notion of cultural ecology, which is a study of the processes by which society adapts to its environment, which requires an examination of societies and social institutions with one another and with the natural environment as a whole. And Manners goes through and he talks about the notion of the both Ehrlich's population bomb, and refutes many of the points in there. And he talks about the optimists too, noting that no one has to starve, nobody else wants them to, that food production is currently outstripping population growth, and indeed has been for a very long period of time, and that quantities of food and money are needed to eliminate hunger are relatively small. It's just a political will that's lacking overall. So overpopulation in international accounts is often in those areas, those states that do not produce enough food for all their people. There's this idea that these are isolated states, right? And they can't produce all the food. They also don't have the money through trade and services or other commodities to get all the foods that the population needs. And so the issue of humanitarianism gets raised here, and the idea of a concern for future generations to reduce numbers of overpopulated areas. Today, global interdependence and reliance on imported goods is necessary, as Manners points out, across the globe in order to provide for all sorts of needs. So think about this interdependence in terms of things that you would consume on a daily basis, in terms of where those goods, services, products, where they come from and how they get to you. And so for Manners, the global condition is not a result strictly of overpopulation of numbers of people, but the inappropriate channels of distribution